One of the things that we're looking to do is eliminate the transmission of HIV from person to person in the UK by 2030. That's a big goal that we're all really working towards. Some of the people that we're speaking to now who are, 13, 14, 15, when they're in their 20s, they might not have to worry about HIV anymore if we're successful. Like it won't be circulating anymore in the UK. Sexual and reproductive health is the national priority that it deserves to be. This fear has pervaded, it's persisted, and there hasn't been that kind of mass media campaign to update people about the modern reality of HIV. If you have an undetectable amount of HIV in your bloodstream because it's being controlled by medication, that means two things. HIV is no longer attacking your immune system. You can live a long and healthy life. You'll have a normal life expectancy. But also, you cannot pass HIV on to your sexual partners. And that's really important for people to be aware of. This is a thing that surprises a lot of people. There are more women than men living with HIV. So 53% of people around the world who are living with HIV are women. People were dying of AIDS, and it didn't seem like anybody was really helping or caring. And legislation was being brought in that was, pushing things backwards. Some of the advances that were made were, it seemed like they were going to be rolled back. And I, not to be dramatic about it, but I kind of see the same noises happening today. Once you start teaching about these things, you also have to teach about consent and boundaries. And, that's something that I think is being done much better now. I don't think it was done at all before, but it's being done much better now with young people. But people my age and older don't understand consent and boundaries very well at all.
I think as well, where we were speaking about negative media depictions, it's important to have, for example, like these podcasts and, It's a Sin, AIDS, the Untold tapes. I know that's obviously kind of going back to, the more harder times, but it's important to show that the positive side that the movement is bringing.
Welcome back to Sexonomic, a podcast where we speak about all things sexual economy. Today I have a very special guest with me. His name is Eugene, and he works for the Terrence Higgins organisation. Eugene, if you want to let the audience know a little bit about yourself and what you do, and what is the Terrence Higgins Trust?
Okay, so I'm Eugene Lynch. I'm the Positive Voices Manager at the Terrence Higgins Trust. A little bit about me. So I originally grew up in Ireland. You can probably tell from the accent. I moved to London in 2004, and in 2013 I was diagnosed with HIV, so 10 years ago. And I had a pretty rough time for the next few years in terms of my mental health, addiction, drugs and alcohol, a lot of anxiety, a lot of panic, and eventually things got so bad, it was really debilitating. So at that point, I contacted the Terrence Higgins Trust for help. I got some counselling, specific counselling for people living with HIV. I got into rehab and really started to turn my life around. Basically, ever since then, I've been volunteering and then working for the Terrence Higgins Trust. So my job involves managing our Positive Voices program. We have almost 40 people living with HIV all over the UK who share their personal stories. And we also raise awareness about HIV in talks to lots of different types of audience. And I also manage the HIV Confident Ambassadors Programme, which is a new programme based in London, which is supported by London Fast Track Cities. And the aim of that programme initially is to work with people in the health and care sector to get them to understand HIV and HIV stigma a bit better. But that's going to expand in scope over the next few years. And then we do some kind of specific stuff in my area as well around, we've got like a specific Positive Voices program in prisons that we're doing in partnership with a couple of other organizations, Sophia Forum, CI Squared Bureau, and we're working with the National AIDS Trust to just improve the situation for people living with HIV in prison and to raise awareness in prison about issues related to HIV. So that's kind of me and the day job. The Terrence Higgins Trust is the largest HIV and sexual health charity in the UK. We have a range of different services. So I work in our Living Well area, and that's kind of everything to do with living well with HIV. So we provide lots of different types of service, including counselling for people living with HIV. We also provide counselling for people who are not living with HIV, but who want to talk about kind of sexual health issues and that sort of thing as well. And we provide a helpline, THT Direct, which is open, I think, at the moment, 5 days a week. And it will answer lots of different types of questions that people might have. We also have a few different things that support people living with HIV, including our hardship fund, advice service. So we give people advice on things like housing and benefits, and we can do some very basic legal advice, but we can also signpost people to other organizations. So that's our Living Well services. The rest of the charity got a few different things that we do, but a large part of what we do is providing sexual health services in various different areas, and those are commissioned by either the NHS or by local authorities. So we, for example, in Bristol, in Brighton, in Essex, we manage a lot of the local sexual health services, and that's a large part of what we do as well. And that'll be everything from providing support to people, doing some basic testing, outreach services, working with the community. There's a lot of very kind of community-based work that we do in that area. We also do kind of policy and advocacy work as an organisation, so we try to influence government policy on HIV and sexual and reproductive health. And the aims of the charity are kind of threefold at the moment. So one of the things that we're looking to do is eliminate the transmission of HIV from person to person in the UK by 2030. That's a big goal that we're all really working towards. One is to be here for people living with HIV for as long as they need us. And then thirdly, to make sure that sexual and reproductive health is the national priority that it deserves to be. So that's kind of the charity in a nutshell.
Okay, wow, it's a lot of information, but thank you for sharing. So obviously your diagnosis and affiliation with the charity started back in 2013. Obviously we'd come a long way from, the 80s and when this kind of really expanded. But what would you say are the milestones that have got better since 2013, and what can get better after this?
If I go back a little bit, one of the biggest milestones in kind of the fight against HIV was the availability of effective combination therapy to suppress HIV. So it's a treatment for HIV that's very effective. It's not a cure, but that came onto the scene around 1996. We sometimes talk about before 1996 and after 1996 because that's when things really fundamentally changed. After 1996, we got lots of different types of medication available for people who are living with HIV. And right into the 2010s, we started to get, a situation where you could take one pill every day and that would be enough to suppress HIV and for you to live a long and healthy life. One of the key milestones was the fact that we proved in the mid-2010s that people who are on effective HIV treatment can't pass the virus on to their sexual partners. It's known as U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. So we knew that from the mid-2010s onwards, and we're trying to kind of get that information out as much as possible. Another couple of milestones, PEP became available for people who need it, again, around that time. PEP is post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. So if you've had a risk for HIV in the last 72 hours, you can go and get on PEP and you won't be able to acquire HIV as long as you take it correctly. And then PrEP also became available, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. So that's a pill that you can take to stop you from getting HIV. That became available sort of 2014, 2015 to a large extent. People started accessing it in various different ways. They were buying it privately and that sort of thing. But then later on, sort of 2018, 2019, it became available on the NHS for free, people who needed it. So that's another big milestone, the availability of PrEP. Those things combined mean that we're in a situation now in the UK where the number of new diagnoses of HIV has been falling consistently since about 2014. So there are fewer and fewer people being diagnosed every year, and that's great news. We're working towards the next milestone, which is 2030, where we want that number to go down to zero. So we can get to a stage where we eliminate the transmission of HIV from person to person.
So the job now doesn't so much seem with medication and people taking medication, but the bigger problem now seems like working with stigmatization, and that seems to be the final push, if I'm right or if I'm wrong.
Yeah, stigma is the biggest thing that we need to tackle in terms of HIV, and that's for a few reasons. People living with HIV experience a lot of stigma in lots of different ways in society. A lot of it is based on fear, the fear that's been around since the 1980s, and a lot of it's based on outdated information that people have. So, people still think that
not
HIV
from reliable sources.
No,
as well.
not from reliable sources. People still think that HIV is a death sentence, or that it's very easy to pass on, or that you could get it from sharing a cup with someone or from a toilet seat. Stuff that we thought we'd left behind. People still believe, and that's largely because of the stigma that's associated with HIV. So that's one thing that we're really trying to tackle, both because it will improve the lives of people like me who are living with HIV, so that we're not demonized, but also we know that this goal of eliminating transmission, we won't be able to get there unless we tackle the stigma associated with HIV, because people who fear HIV stigma are less likely to take a test. They'd rather kind of not know than have their fears confirmed. Like, we know that from kind of studies we've done, people we've spoken to. So if we can take away that stigma, if we as a society can look at HIV as the modern virus that it is, and the fact that we've got kind of effective treatment and ways of preventing transmission of HIV, if we can get people to understand that better, then it will take away that fear. It will take away the kind of mystery that sometimes surrounds HIV.
Yeah, so it's almost bringing people to a place where they're having tolerance and they are getting educated. But again, I did an interview with Dr. Frankie when she started doing work around this. The thing that came to her straight in mind was the tombstone of AIDS, the advert back in the 80s, and kind of all the fear back then. And that's your first introduction even as a child, when you kind of asked, oh, what is HIV? I know that's certainly the first introduction I got, and I'm 25 next month. So for me to get that and not to even be born then is very indicative of the stigma that still goes around.
Absolutely. Stigma that exists is rooted in the messages that people got in the 1980s. So there was this big, as you mentioned, advertising campaign that the government did.
By a famous director.
Yeah, you had, this kind of big scary voice. It was John Hurt, doing a big scary voice. It was on TV. There was a leaflet put in, through the door of every household in the UK. And the tagline was AIDS, don't die of ignorance. And that was AIDS was chiseled into a tombstone in the advert. There was another advert as well called the iceberg advert, which was very, very similar, but it was basically this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Because the messaging was not wrong in a sense. You don't want to die from not knowing about something. But I can't help but feel the fear-mongering probably was the wrong thing. And it's one of those things, the deliverance was not the right message.
Yeah, I think it was quite strategic. I don't want to kind of defend it because I think it's caused a lot of problems. But I think it was quite strategic in that it was the first thing that really started putting out information from a reputable source, because there was lots of rumor and stuff flying around. So they were kind of saying, this is what it is. This is what you need to know about it. It could affect anyone, which was the message that they were putting out very clearly, which is true, and that you need to be informed. Those things were correct. Those are the kind of things that you would hope. But the way that they delivered it was to try and make everybody really, really afraid. So fear was the tool that they used to try and get people to protect themselves. And what that did was instill this huge amount of fear that people still have today whenever they hear HIV or people talk about AIDS sometimes as well. This fear has pervaded, it's persisted, and there hasn't been that kind of mass media campaign to update people about the modern reality of HIV, which is that it's a controllable illness and it's one that we're looking to eliminate. And we can eliminate. We could be the first country in the world to do it by 2030. So we had a Life Really Changed campaign. It was an award-winning campaign, and there were posters up in bus shelters and in billboards and stuff like that in some kind of key areas where there's high prevalence of HIV. So around London, in parts of Glasgow, and Manchester, and a few other places. And the tagline of it was, when I was diagnosed with HIV, my life really changed. And then for each individual person who's featured in the poster, there would be something that changed when they were diagnosed with HIV. So there are things like, I became a pilot, I'm training to be a nurse, became a radio presenter. There's lots of kind of different things just to show people that, HIV has changed. The way that we look at HIV has changed, and people are living, people aren't suffering with HIV. They're living, living long, healthy lives with HIV.
And you can still get access to the parts of your life that you thought might stop because of the stigmatization. Because a lot of people would never, I'd assume, want to kind of confess that they do have HIV because of the stigma. So the fact that those people can go on and have careers and, be a pilot or train to be a nurse or a DJ host, it shows that even, socially things are getting better.
Yeah, absolutely. The pilot things was important as well, because there was a rule until very recently that you couldn't be a pilot if you were living with HIV.
How come?
It was a thing that was a holdover from the 1980s. It was a rule in the UK and other parts of the world that basically said, I don't know what the thinking was. I think it was something to do with some of the complications that you could get if you developed AIDS-related illnesses. Some of them were brain-related and they could affect your brain. I think that's where it came from. But right up until, I think about 2018, 2019, there was a rule that said you couldn't be a pilot if you were living with HIV. And we managed to, working with others, get that rule changed because it didn't make any sense. It didn't hold up to the kind of modern kind of medical reality. So that has changed. There's a few things that have changed in recent years through some of the campaigning work that we and other organizations have done. People can now join the armed forces living with HIV. Up until 2 years ago, you couldn't. If you're diagnosed with HIV while in the armed forces, you can have a full career. That has changed as well quite recently. There's a few things that, like, HIV shouldn't limit someone. And there's a few of those like old little things that we still need to change. One of the things is there's a rule in boxing that you can't box if you're living with HIV because people fear, blood and things like that. But again, that doesn't hold up to medical reality. So that's one of the things that we're looking to change.
Has
and also
to be
there's
a hell of a boxing match.
Boxing can be a blood sport, but somebody who's living with HIV, who's on effective treatment, who has an undetectable viral load, is not going to pass HIV on through blood. It's actually really, really difficult to pass HIV on through blood, even if you have a high viral load. It just doesn't happen in reality. Again, the fear and the misinformation is one of the things that's still a holdover, that people kind of think, oh, blood is one of the things that contains HIV, therefore if I come in contact with someone's blood, it could be passed on to me. That's just not really how it works. It's quite difficult to pass on HIV.
But it is possible through blood is what you're saying, but it's not as likely as people think. No. So if you look at the statistics of new cases of HIV in the UK, the vast majority of cases of HIV are from unprotected anal and vaginal sex. Those are the two biggest, by far, the two biggest routes of transmission of HIV. The third one, and it happens about 50 to 100 people every year in the UK for the last 5-10 years, have contracted HIV from sharing needles when injecting drugs. So that is a route from blood where you can contract HIV. If you think about that, and apologies if this is triggering for any listeners, but when people are injecting drugs, they're drawing blood generally into a syringe where the drugs are mixed up. They're then injecting themselves. They're then passing maybe that needle on to someone else. They're doing the same thing. And so they're injecting directly into the bloodstream. There's a very short window of time when that needle is passed from one person to another. There's a vacuum inside the needle which protects, any HIV that might be present. So that is a way that HIV can be passed on through blood. But if you think about, in the NHS, people are taking blood from people all the time. Needle stick injuries happen, which is where you accidentally prick yourself with a needle. We haven't had a case of HIV transmitted from person to person through a needle stick injury in the UK in the last 24 years. Okay. It's only ever happened 5 times. And we know from the studies that have been done, NHS workers who have a needle stick injury are exposed to patient blood that contains HIV in transmissible quantities on quite a regular basis. And, we haven't had a transmission that way in 23 years plus. Any other potential route of transmission that involves blood will be less risky than somebody accidentally pricking themselves with a needle. So the ones people have to kind of look out for and kind of take the, I suppose responsibility is the right word, is sex.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. If you are injecting drugs, make sure that you use clean, fresh needles. That's really important. Needle exchanges are available. But the main way that people might contract HIV is through sex. And it's important to know how HIV is passed on, what different activities, could pass on HIV, and how you can protect yourself.
Okay, so best methods of contraception. I know it sounds quite basic, but it's good to kind of get the message out there. So how's the best way to protect yourself from HIV?
Okay, so there are lots of different ways. This is where I'm supposed to say like condoms, PrEP, testing, treatment, PEP. Yep. We can go through all of those. But I think it's important to think about it in terms of like an individual and, their own mental health, the way that they approach sex and stuff like that. I think it's really important to kind of start at that kind of psychological level.
Before the physical.
Yeah. So, looking after your own sexual health and taking care of yourself in general, being kind to yourself, whatever, that's really important. If you take an approach to this, that it's not like this horrible chore that I need to do to make sure I don't get HIV, but it's like something I'm doing as a way of taking care of myself is, looking after my sexual and reproductive health. I think that's a good kind of mindset to be in.
Yeah.
So, and knowing things like, what your boundaries are and, being prepared and stuff like that is really important. So then the methods that you can use, condoms are very effective at preventing HIV transmission, unwanted pregnancy. They'll reduce the risk of most of the STIs.
What's the stat on a condom? Because I guess that's for a lot of STIs.
Yeah, so it really depends on if they're correctly used. Yeah. So it's important to know how to use a condom correctly.
I think this is for the straight men. They don't really know. The amounts of times like a man's looked at me and said, "Can you put it on for me? It'll be sexy." Like, learn to put on your own condom.
There are demonstrations available. So, that is important to know. It's also important to know that there are different types and sizes of condom available, and it's important to get a size that fits you. That's really important.
Don't soothe your ego. Don't buy an XL if you're not an XL.
Absolutely. And then, making sure that, for example, when you're putting it on, you've got to pinch the teat at the top to make sure that there's no air trapped in the condom, because that's where it can easily break.
I had an ectopic pregnancy from a broken condom, and I think it's maybe because of that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
that's serious and can be quite painful.
It can be life-threatening, but it's really important to squeeze the top.
Yeah.
So.
So condoms do break. That's the thing. Yeah. So you got to make sure that you're not doing anything that would rip or tear the condom when you're putting it on. You got to make sure that there's enough kind of space.
Using the right lube with it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're going to have particularly rough sex, if that's what you're into, or if you're going to have anal sex and stuff like that, there are extra strong condoms you can get as well. But all condoms are quite good at actually, providing that kind of barrier. It will massively reduce the risk of HIV. If it's used correctly, it will pretty much eliminate the risk of HIV and also unwanted pregnancy. And it will reduce the risk of most other STIs. The only reason I'm not saying it completely eliminates it is there are STIs like herpes that can be passed on just through skin-to-skin contact. And it would be extremely unusual but not impossible for something bacterial like chlamydia or gonorrhea to be passed on just through genitals coming together.
Yeah.
Whether there's a condom involved or not. But, that's very, very low risk.
Should also be no shame in people asking when they had their last test, or would you be able to get tested before if it's quite a serious partner? Or
yeah, I think if you're getting into a new relationship, or if you are coming out of a relationship and you're thinking I'm actually probably going to be quite sexually active for the next while, that's a good time to test.
Yeah.
Just to get like the full MOT. So testing is one of the other kind of things. So condoms is one. Testing is one, treatment is one, and we'll come on to talk about PrEP and PEP as well. These are all ways that you can prevent HIV transmission. Testing is really important because you need to know your status. So sometimes people ask us like, what symptoms would I have if I got HIV? And it's not usually very useful to talk about symptoms because a large number of people won't get any symptoms at all. So the only way really to know your HIV status is to do a test.
That's why when it first arrived in the 80s, it got so bad because people were not having symptoms. And then obviously the migration to AIDS.
Yeah, the first symptoms that really showed up that showed that there was something going on were people developing very serious life-threatening AIDS-related illnesses.
When it's too late.
Yeah. And that would be, they will have probably contracted HIV maybe 7 to 10 years before on average. They wouldn't have known that anything was wrong really for that period of time. So what we need is to diagnose people as early as possible. We need people to test regularly for HIV and know their HIV status. That's really, really important. And testing, there's lots of different ways you can do it. So you can go to a GUM or sexual health clinic. You can get a test there. Most of them provide rapid testing. So you prick your finger, you need a couple of drops of blood. You'll get a result within 15 minutes. It's very quick. Those types of tests, wherever you're kind of pricking your finger and getting a couple of drops of blood, or there's also an oral swab test where you swab your gums, they'll give you a conclusive result 90 days after a risk. So there's a window period. It's important to remember that.
If it's not through saliva, the infection, how come they can swab your gums?
That's a question that comes up a lot when we do our talks. So saliva is not a bodily fluid that can pass HIV on to someone else. It's quite hostile to HIV, so it breaks it down. And that's why in many cases oral sex doesn't represent a good way of transmitting HIV because of the presence of saliva. However, what the oral swab test for HIV does is you swab your gums with it, you get like saliva and some other kind of material on it. It detects antibodies. So your immune system's response to the presence of HIV. And so you're doing an antibody test. A lot of tests are what are known as duo tests. So they're looking for antigen, which is the protein on the outside of the HIV virus, and antibodies, which is what your body produces as a response to the HIV being present. So when you're swabbing your gums, you're looking for the antibodies that your immune system is producing in response to HIV.
Okay. So take me through like what the actual virus is in terms of the science. So someone is in a situation where they are infected by HIV. What is the thing that's going on internally with them in terms of what the virus is? Okay,
so the process would be you come in contact with HIV, usually through sex, through a bodily fluid. It needs to get to your bloodstream, first of all. So it's absorbed through mucous membranes, either in the vaginal walls or in the anal walls, usually. It gets to your bloodstream. And then that's where it starts kind of doing its work. So what HIV is trying to do is what any virus is trying to do, make as many copies of itself as possible. So what it will do is it will get into cells in your bloodstream called CD4 cells. Those are part of your immune system. They help the immune system to identify the presence of infections. It will go inside the CD4 cell, and that's kind of where it lives, and it will change the DNA of the CD4 cell. It's quite clever the way it does it. And then it will start firing off copies of itself. So it will start reproducing. And they go out into the bloodstream and they find other CD4 cells. And eventually it will destroy the CD4 cell from the inside. And that's why a virus that affects the immune system. So it's destroying those cells from the inside.
And it lowers the defenses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the point that you acquire HIV, between about 9 days and 6 weeks after that point, what will happen is your body will basically recognize the presence of these cells. They'll reach your lymph nodes. Your body will be like, hey, there's something going on here. The immune system will start to respond, start to go into action, and it starts producing antibodies. And at that point, you might have what's known as seroconversion illness. So between 9 days and 6 weeks after transmission of HIV, you might start to get just general cold and flu symptoms, maybe a fever, maybe a headache. A lot of people don't get any symptoms. Some people get a rash, and that's quite telltale, like a purple rash on their chest. But again, it's important to remember that most people won't get any symptoms, or if you do get symptoms, you'll just think you have cold or flu. Like, you won't be able to tell the difference.
And I know some people who have health anxiety, they'll be thinking, I've got a cold and a flu, I've got HIV.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then again, the important thing is, don't try and diagnose yourself with symptoms. Go get a test just to be sure.
Don't do WebMD.
Yeah, exactly. So at that point, you might have a seroconversion illness. You might not notice anything. But what is happening is your body is mounting this response. And what people don't realize all the time is your body's actually quite good at doing that for HIV. So it starts to produce antibodies, lots and lots of them. That's one of the things that we're testing for as well. And it will start to get some control over the virus. So where the HIV is circulating in your blood, your antibodies that your body's producing will start to reduce that level. So the level of HIV in your blood starts to go down quite quickly. The level of antibodies is going up. That's why we do duo testing, because you're looking for both of those things. So one will be high at one point and one will be high at another point. And that way, if we're testing for both, we were able to pick it up sooner.
So it's like an opposite correlation of what's happening. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So then your body's got HIV under relatively good control. Like, your immune system's doing its job. The problem is HIV is hiding out inside the immune system, destroying it from the inside. So over a period of time after that point, usually 7 to 10 years, it's reducing the amount of CD4 cells in your body. Your body finds it harder then to identify and start to attack other pathogens like viruses, bacteria, stuff like that. So that's when, before HIV treatment and before we got this modern medicine, people would start to develop what's known as AIDS-related illnesses. And those will be things like certain types of cancer, certain types of pneumonia, tuberculosis. These are things that maybe your body would be able to fight off if it had a fully functioning immune system. But because HIV has weakened the immune system over a period of time, they can take hold and they can be deadly. So that's kind of the whole life cycle of HIV. And what we need to do is intervene quite early in that process and get someone onto treatment. And what that will do is it will reduce the amount of HIV in your blood to what's known as undetectable levels for the vast majority of people. And if you have an undetectable amount of HIV in your bloodstream because it's being controlled by medication, that means two things. HIV is no longer attacking your immune system. You can live a long and healthy life. You'll have a normal life expectancy. But also, you cannot pass HIV on to your sexual partners. And that's really important for people to be aware of. If you get onto treatment for HIV, that's the thing that's going to help us to stop transmission.
Do you think as well, when we kind of established it was a HIV virus, people would associate the worst risks of AIDS and these illnesses you would get with HIV worse for stigma, because you're almost associating the end thing that is preventable with the thing that starts at the beginning?
Yeah.
I think when people think HIV, they think of all the pictures they're shown in sexual health classes or things they've seen in the media. But
yeah, it's something that somebody developing AIDS-related illnesses is something in the modern world that we can prevent. It still happens. So around 700,000 people around the world every year die of AIDS-related illnesses. So that is
not in the UK, that's globally.
That's globally, yeah. In the UK, that number is not zero, but it's very small. So if somebody is either diagnosed very late with HIV, or they don't get a diagnosis and they develop, very serious complications, or in some rare cases, if somebody stops taking their medication and then they get, one of these illnesses, they can still die of what is an AIDS-related illness. Like, that is a possible thing that can happen, and that's something that we really need to act to prevent, because it's totally preventable. Those deaths are totally preventable. And even on a global scale, like the fact that there are still that number of deaths from AIDS-related illnesses is really shocking and scandalous. Like, that's something that we have the power to stop.
And as well, you don't have to go into a sexual health clinic to test. You can get kits at home through SHL, I think.
Yeah, in London, shl.uk. In pretty much almost every borough in London, you can get a test kit sent home.
They're working on putting in outer boroughs now, I think, as well.
Yep, it's slightly complicated because there are different services available in different parts of the country, and that's something that we need to kind of work on and make sure that we have like equitable access to sexual health services everywhere.
It's almost more of a political thing, because the people who do different boroughs, it's like politicians giving their buddies the company to go and do it and say, okay, we'll give him the commission to go and do it.
I think it's more about the fact that there are lots of different people responsible for commissioning sexual health services. Like, it's really complicated. So, I mean, I don't want to go into loads of detail, but if you're in England and it's National HIV Testing Week, you can get a test kit posted to your house wherever you are. But that's for like a few weeks of the year. And that is, full disclosure, it's provided by HIV Prevention England, which is a service run by the Terrence Higgins Trust. But that's, 1 week, or actually, it lasts for a few weeks, but we kind of call it 1 week a year. And that's everywhere in England. If you're in Wales, there is a national postal testing kit service. So you can get HIV, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, like all those types of tests in one test kit posted to your home anywhere in Wales.
Yeah.
In Scotland, it's a little bit more complicated. So there's one place that you can go to get a postal HIV testing kit, and then depending on where you are, you can get kind of testing kits for other STIs. If you're in London, you mentioned SHL, so they will provide testing kits all over London and for everything that you would want to test for at home. But then in different parts of the country, it varies depending on what your local authority is commissioning, or what like free services are available through charities and other organisations. So it's a bit complicated. The best way to find out is to go to our website, the Terrence Higgins Trust website, tht.org.uk. We've got a test finder, and it will find you a free HIV test anywhere in the UK, and depending on where you live.
It's almost more important to reach out to those rural areas, because, I think people who live in rural areas, at least my family, like, the city, it's horrible. Why would anyone want to live in a city? But also, you kind of get bombarded with advertisements, information, and you kind of have access to all of this stuff. But in rural areas, sometimes things can feel backwards in a generation, and they don't really speak about things. They don't have access to certain information, and they might not have access to the postal thing. So I think what's important about your work as well is that you do outreach to loads of different areas. Yeah,
absolutely. And there's lots of organisations, HIV organisations up and down the country in different local areas who do lots of great outreach services and try to get those testing and that support to as many people as possible, and particularly if the services aren't great in finding them. One thing just to say about postal testing kits, there's two types, not to get too technical, but there's a self-test, which is basically a bit like the test that we were doing for COVID at home. So you get a sample of blood and you'll get your own result within 10 to 15 minutes. So it will tell you, if it's reactive to the presence of HIV. The other type of kit is the self-sampling kit. So you need to put a sample into a box and post it, and then they'll test it at where they receive it. So those are the two different types of postal testing kit, self-test and self-sampling test. You can get a test, and you'll get a rapid test usually at a GUM clinic or sexual health clinic. GPs can also do testing, and they've got a couple of different ways they can do it. So they can either do a rapid test, or they'll take blood from your arm and send it to the lab if they're doing like lots of different types of tests. Those tests where you have blood taken from the arm and sent to the lab are conclusive more sooner than rapid test kits. So you'll get conclusive result 45 days after a risk has taken place.
So it's really good if you have someone with quite high anxiety about being exposed, you can go and get a rapid test.
Yeah, or if the timeline, if you're thinking about, I wonder about that thing that, or like sex I had, I don't know, a couple of months ago, I want to be absolutely sure I need to get that type of test, and that will tell me right now. Without me having to wait till the 90-day point. The other thing to remember is any type of HIV test will pick up more than 90% of infections within the first 28 days. So that's a month after something happened is a good time to test. It'll give you a really good indication. It just won't be completely conclusive.
And I think with the NHS, from what I know, is if you think you have been exposed to any STD, you can obviously say that to the person who is taking your appointment, and they will immediately move you up if you think you've had definite exposure. Because people who are just going for testing in terms of routine, not high priority. The people who obviously think, okay, I've been exposed, that's more high priority.
Yeah, they do it on a kind of a risk basis. So if you're there for like a regular checkup, we want to encourage as many people as possible, if you're sexually active, to test on a regular basis for everything. That's the best of looking after your kind of sexual health. But if you have symptoms or you think I've definitely been exposed to an STI, that's an important thing to contact your local sexual health service about.
Mm-hmm.
They will prioritize an appointment for you.
How at risk are women?
Well, okay, so we can talk about HIV and STIs.
Well, through HIV, but sure, let's
Okay.
include the other ones.
So if you look globally, this is a thing that surprises a lot of people. There are more women than men living with HIV. So 53% of people around the world who are living with HIV are women.
And that's subsidised in Africa, would I say?
Yeah. So
Okay.
there are about 39 million people around the world living with HIV. More than 20 million of those are living in Eastern and Southern Africa. And the people who are most at risk of acquiring HIV today are women and girls aged 15 to 24 living in Eastern and Southern Africa. There are 15,000 new diagnoses a week of women and girls aged 15 to 24 in Eastern and Southern Africa. So it is a condition that, affects women and disproportionately affects women, especially in other parts of the world. In the UK, about a third of people living with HIV are women. That's, again, when we ask people how many, what proportion of people do you think are women, they won't guess right. They'll normally say it's very small, but in the UK, it's about a third.
Women sometimes have an easier time of being bisexual or trying both kind of genders. I do think they probably get a bit of stigma of, oh, look, it's the two lesbians gonna join it. They get a bit of that. But with men, I think where they suffer a little bit more in terms of trying with different sexualities is they will get more of a stigma of, oh, that's not masculine. And we're getting away from it, which is good. But obviously, when you say that, my mind goes to men who maybe because they've not been allowed to explore their sexuality, which is almost a gay topic of acceptance, then that kind of jumps to that and the disease, and they're not allowed to explore that, so they'll feel more shame around sexual health, and it's almost like a domino effect and stuff.
Intersecting levels of shame and stigma and stuff that can build up, and that can mean that somebody is less likely to engage in a service. And we really need to remedy that and to get people to understand, having sex is a perfectly natural thing to do.
Yeah.
Everybody does it. It's something
And
that
to
we want
explore.
people. Yeah, and to explore your own sexuality and work out what you enjoy, what gives you pleasure, what you're comfortable with, where your boundaries are. That's something that really should be encouraged and celebrated. We as an organization, we're quite sex positive, so we'll pretty much never put out a message that tells people not to have sex to protect themselves from STIs. We want people to have, enjoyable, full, healthy sex lives, but just be aware of the risks and to look after themselves and test and use prevention methods.
It's like telling someone don't click on the big red button, or like telling a teenager never have sex, or it's just not going to work.
And, you mentioned kind of men who have sex with men in a kind of a broad category. One thing that I've learned in the process of doing this job, particularly in volunteering on our helpline for the last few years, we talk in the sexual health kind of area about gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men. And sometimes people are like, what do you mean, other men who have sex with men? And it is a phenomenon that happens out there in the world. Somebody who's a man who is heterosexual might have sex with another man. That doesn't make them gay or bisexual. They would identify themselves as heterosexual. It might just be something they do either to try it one time, or because it's convenient, or for economic reasons, or, there's lots of different reasons why somebody might do that. But that doesn't make them gay or bisexual.
In the strip club, I think I've come across, I just tried to count about 6 men who've done that. And I think that's through what you would call swinging, trying different things, go to sexual parties. But it's common, people just want to try it, just as like, oh, I went and kissed a girl last night. Of course, it's human, you want to try. But it's interesting, in AIDS, the Unheard Tapes, which is a really great documentary on BBC, if anyone's not listened to it. But a man speaks about how back then in the 80s, so much of why, the gay community were almost rampant in terms of so much sex was happening is almost because of the marginalization. So he goes into how everything did become sex heaven and all of this stuff, especially in London, because people were marginalizing them, putting them down, and they were saying, well, no, like I want to love who I want to love, and I want to like fuck, sorry, that's a really strong word, fuck who I want to fuck, and I want to, you know, if I want to do it and do all the things that straight people do, I'm going to do it, you know, with my chest out and proud. And that's a really great sentiment. You should. But also, what is the most heartbreaking thing is that this virus was happening. Yeah. So obviously that's not going to help.
If you look at like the history of LGBT plus people, particularly in like Europe and North America, there's this like kind of brief shining period. In England, like homosexuality was decriminalized, I think in 1967. I'm originally from Ireland. It wasn't decriminalized till 1993, but it became something that was not as taboo. I mean, it was still taboo. There was still a lot of stigma and you know, societal shame around it, but things started to improve. You know, gay and bisexual men started finding each other, and you got this point where they're like, I'm going to cast off all of this shame and stigma, and I'm going to be who I am and, you know, have the kind of sex that I want. And that was very liberating. So like there's lots of kind of things in the 1970s and early 1980s where people are, you know, sexually liberated for the first time in a while. And this is in the background as well of women being sexually liberated from like the old kind of like 1950s.
And the birth of the pill.
Yeah. The contraceptive pill goes hand in hand with that. But also like the 60s where, you know, women kind of stood up and said like, we're not going to take this anymore. You know, we are sexual beings who have the right to have the kind of sex life that we want. And all of this is kind of going hand in hand. But then you get this hammer blow in the early 1980s of people starting to die. Yeah. And particularly gay men in the early days. And that sort of brings all of that fear and shame and stigma back. And it's made much worse in the 1980s by the media. The media in the UK in particular, the newspapers, like the stories that they were putting out about gay men in the 1980s were like horrific. And again, you've got this huge kind of societal fear that's building up around this and like almost like monsterization of people. And that's what leads to Section 28, right? Yeah. In 1988, you get Section 28 of the Local Government Act or whatever, which prohibits the I think the exact wording is something like the teaching of homosexual relationships as a pretended family unit. I think that was the thing in schools which are controlled by local authorities. So you've got
almost like this implication of they don't want to depict it as this is normal.
Yeah. They want it to seem abnormal, to be marginalized, in many cases to be demonized. And it, you know, the Pride movement, which had existed since at least the 1970s, kind of kicked into high gear at that point because people were dying of AIDS and it didn't seem like anybody was really helping or caring. And legislation was being brought in that was, you know, pushing things backwards. Some of the advances that were made were, you know, it seemed like they were going to be rolled back. And I, you know, not to be dramatic about it, but I kind of see the same noises happening today, particularly in the political area. So there's this marginalization and demonization of trans people in particular that's going on in the media and in government, and they're talking about changing the way that we teach relationships and sex education in schools to make it, you know, less trans inclusive or to not discuss gender identity. And that just feels like the same playbook from the 1980s recycled. It feels very disheartening because we've made so much progress that like it might be rolled back.
Yeah, I think as well dialogue is necessary to hear different opinions, because part of bringing someone over to maybe your opinion, that sounds bad, bringing someone over to your opinion, but kind of trying to see eye to eye and like see the human side is listening to people who don't have the same opinions as you, you know. Or
just like acknowledging the existence of people who are different. Like when I was in school, felt like I was this alien who'd been like beamed in from somewhere else. Like I didn't fit in. I was never talked about. Like there wasn't, this wasn't normal. It wasn't taught about. It was, you know, and so you get that feeling of I already feel isolation because I'm different to other people, but it's compounded by the fact that it's not being talked about, it's not being taught about, and that sort of thing. And that's, you know, changed over time.
As well, until you move away, I suppose, and start your own life, you're not allowed to access a part of life that brings so much joy.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't express yourself or be the kind of person that you want to be. If you grew up in the 1980s or before as a gay person or like a queer person in general, you have this weight that kind of weighs down on you that, you know, it's almost hardwired into you that you're not normal and that's a bad thing. and that, you know, therefore you're a bad person or you shouldn't be allowed to do certain things. It adds this kind of moral, societal moral level. A lot of it comes from religion and other places that kind of tries to suppress who people are. And I think, you know, I could talk from a personal perspective, like I've come a long way from there, and I realize that, you know, things are very different, but I still have to acknowledge that that's kind of hardwired into me, and I have to kind of fight against that conditioning like all the time.
It's interesting because obviously men cannot create children together biologically, but when they look at women, the thing that they're going to shove onto them is the virtue and the virginity and the chastity, and, you know, you what you have is so precious, and you have more expensive sex cells, and you should probably think about who you create them with. But obviously with men, they don't have that shame to put on them because it's two blokes. But what they're going to do instead is they're going to use something else, and they're going to say, oh, well, this is not the definition of masculinity. This is not what creation decided. So we're going to bash you over the head with a Bible and make you feel that our side is the side to believe. And it's not. It's not the side of science. It's not the side of logic. It's not the side of reason as well.
No, absolutely. You know, queer people across the LGBTQ plus spectrum exist and have for forever, pretty much. And it's important to kind of recognize that. And this idea of, I think a lot of what's happening in kind of, especially with young people, but where people are looking at gender in different ways, you know, people are talking about their gender identity differently. I think that's a really positive, healthy thing, because it starts to cast off those gender norms that society expects you to have. Like, women have to be a certain way and men have to be a certain way. And it's like, no, we're just people. You should be able to express so as a woman, you should be able to express your masculinity. As a man, you should be able to express your femininity. It shouldn't be something that's like stigmatized or shamed.
I think I come from the school of thought, like, I don't really think about it too much. When I'm just, I don't know, I suppose I'm a woman and I'm quite forthright. I don't think I'm being masculine. I just think I'm being forthright. Do you know what I mean? People sometimes do want to label things and some people don't. Like, it's weird. You both agree on the same things, but you have very different ways of doing it. It's just finding out the right balance almost, you know?
But it's kind of like, don't squash somebody's expression just because you think it doesn't fit into some kind of gender norm. Because, like, you know, it's, I don't know, it kind of, I think it dampens creativity and stuff. And if you bring back to kind of like sexual health as well, and reproductive health, that you know, you were talking about the contraceptive pill becoming available and women becoming more sexually liberated and all that kind of stuff. And that is a journey I think that we're still on and still needs to be pushed forward. But society has this, and what we're trying to do, like in our organization as well, is make sure that the system doesn't reinforce this, and sometimes it does, but this expectation that everything to do with sexual and reproductive health, particularly in heterosexual relationships, is the responsibility of women. Yeah. And I have no time for that. Like, men need to step up and take responsibility for their own sexual health and to protect others as well.
Put on your own condoms.
Exactly. Know how to protect yourself. Be aware of condoms. Be aware of PrEP. Be aware of, you know, the things that you need to do if you want to avoid pregnancy, if you want to avoid STIs, or know what to do, you know, test yourself on a regular basis and that sort of thing. Don't rely on somebody else to look after your sexual health. You know, sometimes that you have to kind of fight against the system that starts to reinforce that. So recently, for example, we've had, there was a chlamydia testing program that was for young people under 25, 16 to 25 year olds mainly.
Am I not a young person anymore after I turned 25?
Well, it depends on who you ask, and it depends on which service you're accessing. But chlamydia testing was particularly aimed at people 16 to 25, and free condoms are like really aimed at young people as well. And what happened a few years ago is they decided that because the worst effects of chlamydia affected women, that they would only focus the chlamydia testing program on women. And I think that was a mistake, because it just reinforces that idea that women are responsible for everybody else's sexual health.
I think as well, data would be more conclusive of men have more casual sex. And I don't mean that in a way of women don't. Like, they probably have a lot, and it's a lot on both sides. But men's DNA code is written to reproduce, even if I'd imagine even if your sexuality isn't for women, it's almost like in the hormones. I would say casual sex lends itself more to like a masculine hormonal profile from the terms of sex, not what you identify as. So for them to like base it off females is just bizarre.
It is a bit. I mean, I understand why they're doing it, but I think it's the wrong message.
They're looking at the end thing. They're not looking at the before thing.
Yeah, they're looking at the result of trying to reduce the most harm of chlamydia that you can in the most effective and cost-effective way that you can, but they're not looking at the overall message of like what that tells people about, you know, responsibility when it comes to sexual health.
With the gender identity stuff, it's interesting because I left school and I think we just got this beginning of them probably actually putting it more into school, and now we're getting to the point where they're like, oh, what are we putting into schools and stuff? But we were told the sex is what you're born with, so, you know, your genitalia, and then the gender is what you identify with. Of course, people can go from different sexes to different sexes. I know we have grey areas in terms of like sport and very different things, but people use sport as the leading example of why people can't be transgender, which is ridiculous. That's one component of society. Should it be discussed? Probably, but you can't use the 1% to judge a whole populace of people, you know. It just doesn't seem very fair.
Rhetoric in the media around this has become so inflamed and toxic, and it's creating so much polarization.
Because it gets so many clicks.
Yeah.
The people writing it probably don't even care. They're probably like, I don't really give a shit, but because it creates so much volume, that's why they care, because it pushes sales, it pushes numbers, it makes money.
And the problem is it creates real harms, particularly for the mental health of people who are, you know, gender diverse or looking at their gender in a different way. It's not ultimately helpful. And yeah, I find it really disheartening because, like, I look back at the kind of things that people were saying in the 1980s about gay men in particular, you know, lesbians as well, but gay men in particular. And I'm like, it's just the same recycled fear and ignorance. And people don't understand it very well. Like even that kind of what you might have been taught in school about basic biology, like, you know, sex is binary and gender is about expression. Even that is not enough in terms of like the reality, because intersex people exist, right? People who don't biologically express as, you know, directly male or directly female. That's a thing that happens. It's very like, it's uncommon, but they exist.
The correct word be hermaphrodite or incorrect word?
I think that is a kind of an outdated term.
I'm sorry.
For somebody who maybe has, you know, different like genital or sex characteristics that, you know, might be both male and female. I think intersex people are a bit more complicated. There's more variations of the type of intersex people, both in terms of like their chromosomes or how or like, you know, physically how they appear or their genitalia or stuff like that. Yeah. So there's, you know, there's kind of complications involved, but then also like even coming down to things like hormones and stuff like that, like people are on a spectrum, and, you know, different people, you know, look or express themselves in different ways. And I think that's really interesting, and I think it's something that we should kind of study more and talk about more, rather than kind of saying no, that's too scary, it's binary, it's one or the other, and that's it, and we're not having any more discussion about it, which is like probably like the old fashioned attitude of at least education and stuff like that. I think a lot of things have changed, and that's moved on quite a bit. The media is whipping up this
fear-mongering.
Yeah, fear-mongering again.
In every society you get a ridiculous 1%, and they're using the ridiculous 1% of every society. Liberals use the ridiculous conservative 1%, and we use, well, they do have a lot of ridicule, but like maybe 30%. But sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's people kind of start to move to the extremes, and what you find is a lot of people who maybe are well-intentioned but just misinformed, who are in the middle ground somewhere, who have formed a really negative opinion of trans people, having never met any.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because of what they're told in the media. And all of this kind of like demonization. There's like so many media stories that are really negative about trans people and their motivations and intentions and stuff like that. And it creates this really, really toxic environment. I have lots of people in our organization who are trans or non-binary, you know, and they are like, you really feel it. Like they feel like they're constantly under attack. I go to drug and alcohol recovery meetings, like queer ones based in London, and there are lots of trans people in those meetings who are in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. And, you know, when I hear them talk, they're talking about like not just all of these stories are out there and it's having a big impact on my mental health. But like, I'm being attacked physically on the street every day because of, you know, what's going on. And I don't think people really realize the harm that's being caused by some of these things.
And it's also like, when you look at depictions of what people do in the media, so sometimes you get these stories of, for example, I'm going to use man saves dog from river or something like that. If you're a woman, well, sometimes, like, especially if you're trans or in the community, they'll often label you by your gender identity before anything else. You're not another person before your gender identity. I mean, your gender identity is who you are, but you're other things before that as well. And you'd think human people could connect over that. But again, it's using people's gender identity to form clickbait, to sensationalize, to monetize. It's like you want the rhythm and the money of everything, but you don't want the blues and the pain of everything because you're not going through that.
I'll give you another example of that kind of where it relates to sexual health and HIV in the media. It's really easy if you search online to find stories that they'll usually be in local newspapers, and they all go the same way. So it's like somebody who's very innocent, usually a child, is being tested for HIV because they found a needle in a public place and they pricked themselves. And so like maybe a drug user has discarded a needle and somebody has scratched or pricked themselves with that needle. The headline will be all about the fear. They're basically saying like the parents are facing their worst nightmare waiting for the result of an HIV test on a young child. And like obviously that's a like horrendous thing for a parent to go through. But what the media doesn't do is then come back and tell you that the child tested negative, because that's what always happens in these cases. So they've created this huge amount of fear about, you know, something that people might find in a public place.
Yeah.
But they haven't told you that there has never been a transmission of HIV in the UK from somebody finding a needle in a public place.
Yeah.
But there are stories all the time.
The most scandalous thing is someone's leaving a needle about which isn't safe.
No, I mean, and you know, you could get tetanus, you could get hepatitis. Like that's actually something that, so hepatitis B and C are bloodborne viruses, a bit like HIV, but they survive much better outside the human body. So they can survive for a long time with the wrong temperature, exposed to the air, to the light, and could be passed on. So, you know, I talked earlier on about needle stick injuries in the NHS and that we haven't had one that's led to an HIV transmission in like 24 years. It does occasionally happen with hepatitis. So, you know, there are good reasons why if you do scratch yourself with something, whether it's a needle or not, in a public place, that you just get it checked out, because you might need to test for hepatitis or tetanus or something like that.
But the HIV is what they attach, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the one that everybody fears. Everyone has this huge amount of fear around HIV. So that's the one that makes the news, even though that's not the one that people are going to get. You know, we know that from the statistics.
The kind of weaponization around the stigma of HIV with people's mental health, what kind of impacts do you see and why is it so avoidable?
We can talk about two things in that area. So first is like the mental health of people living with HIV. And we've got lots of survey data and stuff around that to show that people living with HIV are much more likely to experience depression, anxiety, the other common mental health issues, largely as a result of the stigma associated with HIV.
Even today, today's society.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are lots of people who have never shared their HIV status with anybody who's not their HIV doctor, for example. Like that happens. People are still denied service illegally because they're living with HIV in some places. And that might be either in a healthcare setting, which is something that we're really trying to get across to people that is not okay. But also in things like beauty parlors, tattooists, lots of other places where they haven't got the most up-to-date information about HIV and they don't know the risks.
Can someone take that to court?
Yes. I mean, like ideally you wouldn't want to have to take it all the way to court, but our colleagues over at the National AIDS Trust have a discrimination advice service. If you Google National AIDS Trust and discrimination, you'll find that, and they're able to take on individual cases where, like, if somebody like complains to the people who are providing the service and says like this isn't right, and they don't get like a satisfactory response, you could go to the National AIDS Trust discrimination service, and they will open a case, take on the case for you, talk to the people involved, give them the information that they need.
Pro bono.
So I
You
can't
don't know.
I can't speak directly to. I know that discrimination advice service currently for the National AIDS Trust is funded by the National Lottery Community Fund, so they have funding to be able to deliver it. I don't know how long that funding lasts, or whether they have to support that with donations that they receive and that sort of thing, because that's usually the way that happens. But that service will be provided to that individual for free.
And you can always go to no win, no fee as well. I always think with certain things that you might not have money for to do legally. I recently got knocked off a bike, and it's not the same thing, but I got a no win, no fee, and I got a nice chunk of money from it. So, yeah.
I mean, for me, like, I had a situation where about a year ago, my partner took me to a really nice hotel, like a spa hotel for a weekend, and we booked in for like some treatments. I was getting a massage. They had a form that you fill out beforehand, and it asks you about lots of medical conditions. And one of the tick boxes was HIV. And I was like, why is this on the form?
We're not sharing drugs.
Didn't really. I'm like, I'm not going to have sex with this, but it's not that kind of, so like some places you go to, maybe that service is on offer, but this wasn't an offer there. It's not one that I would have been looking for at that time. But, it had this question. So I ticked the box because I was like, this is the area I work in. I should be able to. Did
your mind automatically think that they offered happy endings because of this?
No, what I thought was they don't know how HIV is transmitted.
Okay, so you kind of almost knew the more sadder side before, like, oh, it's
yeah.
Okay.
And I was like, I don't know what they're going to do with this information now that I've ticked it on the form. So I was kind of curious, but I was also like, this was, it was a weekend away. It was my day off. I didn't want to have to do like work stuff. But in the end, they asked what medication I was on as well, and I wrote down all the medications that I'm on for HIV. And I got a massage. It was like a back massage, but the person wore gloves, like surgical gloves, for the massage.
And they weren't for your partner, or
no. So my partner is HIV negative. We've been together for 16 years. He remains HIV negative, and didn't check the box on the form. He got a different treatment. I think he was getting a facial or something. They didn't wear gloves for him. Now, there are lots of reasons why you might wear gloves, like if you're allergic to some of the massage oils or whatever else. But I immediately assumed it was because I ticked HIV on the form, and because they didn't know how HIV was transmitted. So what I did after that, I left it a couple of weeks, and then I wrote them a letter, and I said, look, this was my experience. This is how I felt having experience this, and I kind of said, we have a service where we can come and like teach you about HIV transmission and talk to you about what stigma feels like, and also let you know that if you're collecting people's personal medical information under like the law, GDPR, data protection, all that kind of stuff, you have to have a really good reason. You need to inform people what you're going to do with that information, how long you're going to store it, what it's going to be used for, stuff like that. So I'm like, you've got to be really careful when you're collecting people's medical information that you've got a good reason to do it. And in my opinion, they didn't have a good reason to know about my HIV status. And that would be, even if I was getting like a manicure and they were cutting my nails and they had the potential like to cut my finger or whatever, that's not going to lead to HIV transmission.
Yep.
Like, I went through all the possible scenarios in my head, and I was like, there's no good reason for them to know this. I did some research. I went into the old academic information, and there was one many years ago. There was a treatment for HIV that's no longer used that could cause lactic acidosis, which is a buildup of lactic acid in the muscles. And if you massage someone who had lactic acidosis, you could cause issues. And I was like, that would be a legitimate reason why you want to know if that person is on that particular medication. So that's why maybe those forms were designed that way. So I was giving them the benefit of the doubt. I was kind of saying, like, look, here's a legitimate reason why you might collect that information, but nobody's on that HIV medication for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
And you don't have a good reason to do it now. So, I had this conversation with them. They were actually really good about it. We had a couple of chats on the phone, and they've now taken HIV off their form. They're not asking that question anymore because they know that it's not relevant, and we've gone through why it's not relevant.
I feel because you work in the space you work, and I know you said you didn't want to kind of go into work mode, you almost have that knowledge because you're empowered to know it, and you live in this world where you can access the information. Someone with HIV who, isn't working for the Terrence Higgins Trust and stuff, they're not going to know that. They're going to just feel the stigma and the shame. They're not going to, almost have the confidence to go and say that.
Yeah, no, that's true.
They might not even know the information.
And in that kind of scenario, a lot of people would have just either not ticked on the form, just be like, this is my personal information, I'm not going to tell you I'm living with HIV. Or they would have just, been quiet about it, maybe felt a bit bad about it because they've experienced kind of stigma that they shouldn't have. but just kind of moved on. And I kind of did consider at the time, because I'm quite socially anxious. Like, I don't like confrontation in particular. So I wasn't going to say anything in the moment.
I would have.
But I was, but that's like kind of not what I was. But partly because I'm doing this job, I kind of felt like a responsibility. Because like, if I don't challenge this, who's going to? So I kind of felt like almost obligated to do something about it. But I kind of thought, I got some, I spoke to some people, I got some advice, and I was like, okay, this is something I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it in a way that kind of looks after my own mental health as well, because I don't want to be like really confrontational about it.
If we like maybe go to more towards like the education, as we were speaking earlier, what do you think people could do more successfully to stop these situations from happening? So teaching people in school actually about transmission of HIV.
Yeah.
Ideas, thoughts?
I think that's really important. So the service that we run, Positive Voices, we last year, the year up to April, we did 279 talks to just over 20,000 people. And about half of those were in schools, colleges, universities, young people in education. And it's actually a real privilege to go and speak to young people about these things, because a lot of them don't know a lot about HIV. They haven't had cause to know about HIV. What I find with younger people is they don't tend to have the same level of fear that people of my generation and older generations would have around HIV, because they haven't experienced that like tombstone advert, people dying, not in the UK.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, like transmission rates have been coming down and are quite low, and people, even if they had people in their family living with HIV, they probably wouldn't be talking about it because of the stigma. So most people don't know. Most people probably know someone living with HIV, but most people don't know that they know someone living with HIV, if you know what I mean. So for all of those reasons, I find young people a lot more curious and open-minded, and they ask really great questions when you're talking about HIV and sexual health. Like it's given me a lot of hope for the future.
That goal, you said it gives you more trust that you'll reach the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the people that we're speaking to now who are, 13, 14, 15, when they're in their 20s, they might not have to worry about HIV anymore if we're successful. Like it won't be circulating anymore in the UK. And that that's amazing to think that we can achieve that if we work together and if we kind of get rid of all the stigma.
And it's almost kind of like removing the residue of Section 28 from what happened before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the education that we give, the talks that we do are all inclusive. We talk about different types of sex that people might have and that might lead to transmission risk. We do it in a kind of factual, non-judgmental way because, these things exist and people need to know about them. People are genuinely curious. One thing that you always get a little bit surprised, depending on the audience, like people are sometimes, they put things into boxes. So when you talk to people about, most HIV transmissions come from vaginal and anal sex, and people immediately think, oh, anal sex is something that only happens between two men. And you have to kind of remind them that, like, no, other people have anal sex too. It happens a lot. And it's happening a lot among young people as well, from what we can see. Young heterosexual people are having more anal sex than, people would have in previous generations. And they're not thinking about contraception. So they need to be aware of HIV and STI risk.
Well, there's a huge transmission in both gonorrhea and chlamydia that is going up and up and up because more people are having casual sex. So obviously where there's HIV, that will probably also go as well if that's there in the mix. It makes sense of why rates are going up and stuff.
So rates of chlamydia, gonorrhea and syphilis are going up. That's a phenomenon that's happening across Europe.
And syphilis.
Syphilis, yeah. Increasing quite a lot. Now, chlamydia, gonorrhea and syphilis are all treatable. It's becoming slightly hard to treat some of them. So
super gonorrhea. I spoke to Dr. Frankie about it, and she said it basically it's treatable, but because it's like a mutation. It's the super chlamydia, not the super gonorrhea. You can get rid of the super gonorrhea, but the super chlamydia you can't get rid of. But it's similar, you can still have sex with people and be on medication. It's just that you're not going to necessarily get rid of the virus within you. But that's scary though, no?
Yeah. I mean, we need to get people, testing on a regular basis, getting treated. So we've had PrEP for HIV for quite a while. If we can get people onto PrEP, that will stop them from acquiring HIV. There's also now, it's known as DoxyPEP, but it's basically a lot of people are starting to do this. There's not a huge amount of really robust scientific data on it yet. Some of it's starting to come in now, but it's basically people who are taking doxycycline, which is a antibiotic, after they have sex in order to reduce the risk of acquiring gonorrhea and chlamydia. And for a long time, the medical establishment was like, we really shouldn't be doing this because we're potentially creating the ideal situations for these things to become resistant. That was a bit of an overreaction, I think, at first. And the data that's coming in now is showing us that actually it could be quite effective. So in the near future, you might see that being recommended as a way to proactively stop acquisition of gonorrhea and chlamydia.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. That's quite interesting and new. It is important to say that rates of HIV are going down.
Yeah.
Down quite a lot. And there's also an elimination strategy for hepatitis. So hepatitis C in particular. That is transmitted from blood to blood contact. So it's not typically transmitted through sex, but it can be if there's blood involved in the sex. But, it's something that people need to be aware of. There's a lot more hepatitis C out there than there is HIV. That is treatable. It's curable. It takes a bit of time and the right amount of treatment, but people can be cleared of hepatitis C. Hepatitis B, there's a vaccination, so you can get vaccinated against hepatitis A and hepatitis B. It's a good idea if you're particularly sexually active, if you work in the sex industry, to go and get a vaccination for hepatitis A and B. That will give you protection. You can also get your levels of Hep B immunity checked over time, because sometimes you need to get a booster. So I got the Hep A and B vaccination years and years ago. I've had to have a booster of my Hep B more recently. That might be to do with my HIV, I'm not sure, but important to get those things checked. And also you can get, if you haven't had it before, HPV vaccination, which is...
But it doesn't necessarily prevent you from getting HPV because there's so many strains.
There are lots of strains, so I think there's at least, if I'm remembering correctly, there are at least 23 strains of HPV. I might be mixing it up with herpes, but there's lots of strains. The vaccination protects you, depending on which type of vaccination you get, against like 4 or 5 of them. But those are the ones that cause the most issues. So the ones that cause cervical cancer and other types of cancer in both women and men, you can get a vaccination against. And sometimes they will recommend that you get, so you have to normally get 3 doses of HPV vaccine. They'll normally recommend, even if you have a strain of HPV that they're vaccinated against, that you still get the vaccine, because it could give some protection.
A few of my friends, because they go for the cervical screening, they're similar ages to me, so they have gone and had this jab in high school, but they still do have HPV because obviously people have sex, but it's not the most serious type of HPV that they've probably contracted. And HPV is a very common thing. Is it 70%? I don't know if I can categorically say it's 70% young people.
Before we had vaccination, particularly vaccination of young people, they used to just basically say that if you are an adult and you've had sex, you probably have some strain of HPV. And
your HPV, from what I understand, as you leave your kind of, say you're having a lot of sex in your 20s and you leave it and you settle down with someone, it does migrate and it goes away over time.
I think this is where we're getting into an area that I don't know very well, but I think it will vary from person to person and from HPV strain to HPV strain, and also what else is going on in your immune system and stuff like that. But most of the forms of HPV that are out there, we know, generally don't cause big issues. Yeah. But the ones that do are the ones that we want to make sure that people are protecting themselves against. And it's the same with, like, some people get really worked up about herpes as a it's something that charities and stuff that focus specifically on herpes. But again, that's one of those things that, like, the majority of people, adults in the UK, have some form of herpes. Yeah. If you get cold sores, you have herpes.
Yeah. And it's just that kind of almost dispelling, like, of what it is and stuff. I want to move on to media depictions of what was happening back in the 80s with the HIV and AIDS crisis. It's a sin. Do you think that's a really good representation of what was happening and something that's actually almost positive? So I really enjoyed It's a Sin. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend that you watch it. I think it's available on the Channel 4. I still call it 4OD, even though it hasn't been called out in years. And I think it's on Netflix as well, globally. And it's based on real people. So that's, like, an important thing to remember. Yeah. I've met the family of one of the people who was depicted in this. And I've also met the real life Jill. Okay. So Jill is based on a real person. And I remember watching it and thinking, with the character Jill, I'm like, that's nobody's that good. Nobody's that nice a person. And then I was like, oh no, that's based on a real person and those are real events, and that person is that really, really nice, amazing person. And she's written a book as well, Jill Nalder, which I have. Really great book. And then there were some characters that are like composites of other characters and stuff. But the things that they depict are things that are real and that happened in the 1980s, including, somebody being locked up in hospital, and then, they had to
mount a legal challenge to get that person out of basically being locked up. One of the things I really like about it is it's great drama. So Russell T Davies is a great drama writer. And it really kind of gets you invested in the characters, which is awesome. So and you see kind of how the characters develop and stuff. But it doesn't just show the misery, because a lot of stuff, when you look back at like depictions of AIDS in the 1980s, it's all about all of the terrible things that were happening to people, and that's really important to portray. But this also shows the joy, which is what I really love about it. It's like, people who are facing really, really difficult times, and they're doing their best and they're having fun, but they're also, they've got this specter of this disease that's hanging over them, and it's of the time that it depicts. So it ends at a certain point, and they only got commissioned to write a certain number of episodes, so they didn't get to extend the story to the modern day or to the post 1996 era, where you get to see treatment and people living really well with HIV.
It's not so much a sin anymore, would be the title.
Yeah, I mean, the writers and the cast were really good when they were promoting the show about getting the message out about, you equals you, the fact that people living with HIV can't pass it on now, how HIV has changed and stuff. They became massive advocates for the work that organizations like ours do. It was a really great phenomenon, and it happened during, the period of COVID. So it came out during lockdowns and stuff, and it helped us to get a lot of messages across to people, because people were, looking at the topic for the first time, maybe in a while.
Younger generation accessing the information as well, especially.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it was really important that we follow it up with all of those messages about the realities of HIV today, because if all you learned was all of the stuff from the 1980s, and you didn't learn about the realities today, then I think we're doing young people a bit of a disservice.
But I think as well, where we were speaking about negative media depictions, it's important to have, for example, like these podcasts and, It's a Sin, AIDS, the Untold tapes. I know that's obviously kind of going back to, the more harder times, but it's important to show that the positive side that the movement is bringing. I mean, Ollie Alexander's character at the end, I think there's a moment where he's having a face-to-face with his mum, and he's unfortunately contracted AIDS at this point, and it's a matter of time before he dies. And he's kind of confessing on his deathbed about things. And I think one of the questions might have been, what do you regret and stuff? And he's like, I wish I had more sex. There's so many cocks, so many eyes. And you're kind of like, yeah, well, of course, like, across, like, whether you're gay, whether you're straight, however you want to identify your sexuality, we all have sex, we all participate in the sexual economy. It's important we have positive spaces to access this information and know how to do something safely, and if we do run into trouble, what's the best course of action.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really important that people are aware of the facts, but also that they're able to have the type of, consensual, pleasurable sex that makes them happy, or that they can enjoy.
I don't know how I feel about pleasure being taught in school. I don't know how I feel about that, because in one way, like, I can think about as a teenager and a teacher teaching me about sexual pleasure, I'm like, oh, I don't want to listen to this. But on the other hand, I wish they did teach me about it.
I think in the curriculum, there is a certain point where you can start to, like, with people in their older teens and stuff, you can kind of introduce the topic. I don't think you want to labor the point too much or kind of like go into too much detail, but I think you'd be doing a disservice to young people if you said people only ever have sex for procreation. Like, in the vast majority of cases, they're doing it for pleasure, right?
Yeah.
It's only a small minority of cases that they're doing it for procreation.
If you're in a relationship with someone, the sex you have is a big part of, I suppose, your mental health between each other, and like the attitude you have towards your sex is based off an activity you have between each other, and it's so important. Again,
like, it's important for people to know that many relationships have that strong connection and sexual component. Many other people have, perfectly good sex lives where they have a lot of casual sex and they don't get into kind of deep relationships, and that's also, something to be aware of and not to be stigmatized. And then you've also got people who, for whatever reason, are, maybe they're asexual or whatever, but like, sex is not important for them in a relationship, and that's also important to teach people about, because once you start teaching about these things, you also have to teach about consent and boundaries, and that's something that I think is being done much better now. Like I don't think it was done at all before, but it's being done much better now with young people. But people my age and older don't understand consent and boundaries very well at all.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
And, not just respecting somebody else's boundaries, but understanding, your right to have your own boundaries and how you figure out what those boundaries are for you and how you communicate that to other people that you might be having sex with or whatever. It's a very grown-up conversation to have about sex, and I don't think we're good at like as a society in general, we're not good at talking about sex. I mean, you're going to know that, like, from all the work that you do and the podcast. People are really reluctant to talk about sex, and there's almost like you have to admit that it is something that happens and that people do for pleasure, and that we don't talk about it enough. We don't understand it well enough. We don't understand the psychology of it well enough. And we need to talk more about that sort of thing, I think.
I think consent as well is a really big topic, because even last night in the strip club, I was doing my shift, and we are no contact. There'll be different clubs in different areas, and I think maybe in a few boroughs they have. I wouldn't actually know, but they maybe have a thing where you can touch someone's leg or something. But from what I understand, in the UK, you are not allowed to touch people's intimate areas in strip clubs. And I didn't know in a lot of places in America, you're not allowed to do that, but still they have looser ways of getting around it and stuff. I personally wouldn't do the job if I was touched, if that was the laws. That was my boundary, and that's a very clear boundary I set for myself. But people still try and violate it all the time. And they say, well, this is a strip club. And I said, yeah, strip club, not touch club, strip. Do you understand the word? Do you want me to get you a dictionary? And I always think people probably feel more inclined to treat me a certain way in that place because they have connotations of what it's like, even though we have signs saying don't touch the girls.
This is not something I know very well, but I think there's a big element of this to do with respect. And I think when people are accessing those types of services, whether it's like in a strip club or even like other like
full service,
like sexual services and stuff like that, there's this assumption that because you're the customer, you can get whatever you want, and that the other person's not entitled to have any boundaries,
and that there's always a price. People ask me how much to go back to my hotel room, and I do think everyone has a price. I think everyone does. Everyone's
entitled to have a price if they want one, but like also they're also entitled to say no, and that's the end of the conversation, right? Like it's
mine's
regardless
just 500 million.
Great. Well, so you know your worth and you know your value. I think my price is a lot lower than that, to be honest. But
tenner and a pack of chips.
Well, I full disclosure, I did once when I was in university. I was doing a year abroad, and this was on very old technology. This was back in like 2002, 2003. I was messaging with someone in the country where I was, and
which country were you in?
France.
Oh, okay.
And
they're quite horny.
He offered me money for sex, and I was really broke. I'd been working a lot before I did my year abroad to like save, and I didn't have enough money, and money was really tight. And I was on like a maintenance grant and stuff because like my family were low enough income for that, whatever. So I was like, this is like actually a good proposition for me right now. And it's something that I think I want to try to see if it's for me. And I went and did it. But in my head, the biggest problem I had at the time was, how can I charge this person for something I give away for free so much? That was kind of where my head was. And also I'm quite socially anxious and a big people pleaser. And so in that situation, I kind of didn't feel like I had or deserved to have any boundaries, but also I wanted to make sure that I was delivering a good service, and I didn't want to kind of fall short. And so I went into it with like the wrong attitude. And without having kind of considered that, I could have boundaries or anything like that. But it wasn't a bad experience. It's just one that I didn't repeat after that.
It's interesting and for you saying that, and thank you for sharing your story, because I think a lot of people do engage in sex work and they don't even really know about it. Whether you're sleeping with someone for a promotion in a job, which you shouldn't do, that's very naughty. It's not fair to the other people in the system. Or someone wants to marry into a family of wealth, and you could call that a form of prostitution. But even when you look at the sex work sector in terms of full service, with the gay community, they don't necessarily have all the things in place that the straight community do have. It's a little bit more underground from what I recognise. If you go onto like an escort website, you'll have a whole list of what the girls are willing to do, what they're not willing to do, what they don't want to do, and da-da-da-da-da. From my research, you have obviously like a few kind of what you would call, I don't like this word, but high class escort servicing for gay people. You don't really tend to find lesbian ones, but you don't necessarily have all those boundary lists of what you're willing to offer, what you're not wanting to offer.
I haven't seen it, like in the course of my work, I've seen it a bit, and also like in the, you know, when I was going out a lot on the gay scene, there were, you know, free magazines you could get, and at the back there were some escorts listed, and you know,
Fernando.
There'll be a picture, and there'll be like a description, and you might see, and you get this online as well a lot for like somebody who might have like a commercial profile on a dating website.
Yeah.
There won't be a list of boundaries necessarily. Some people will have some boundaries. They're like, I don't do this, but there'll be a price list.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so if you want this is how much it costs. And
yeah.
I think it's perfectly fine for people, obviously, to set out what does and doesn't work for them, and you know, how much they're going to charge for that, or what their price is, as we were talking before. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But I don't know the economy is like for gay and bisexual men in that area. I've met several people that's their main source of income.
Yeah.
They don't really like talk about it a lot in like the circles that we're in, but like I know that's where they get their income from.
I think you mentioned you get a lot of phone calls off people who've engaged with sex workers on the helpline. Yeah.
So we talked earlier on about like the broad different range of services we have. We do a lot of community outreach service in the places where we have sexual health contracts or sexual health services. So in places like Brighton and Bristol, we have specific sex worker outreach where we try and reach people who other services aren't reaching very well, I think is the way I would describe it. And I was talking to our head of statutory services earlier, who was telling me about in Bristol, we've got this, so we've got two things. We have a sex worker breakfast where people can come along, and it's not about testing for HIV or anything like that. It's about just coming and having peer support with other people who are in the sex industry and talking about like maybe experiences that people have had.
Bad day at the office.
Yeah, sometimes like, you know, the National Ugly Mug.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's real peer support, as in it's managed by, you know, other people who are involved in the sex industry, and, you know, it's an open forum where people can have a chat. But they also have a fast track service. So if you're a sex worker in Bristol, you can get a card, which if you approach one of the sexual health clinics like that we're involved in, you show them the card, you'll get fast tracked for testing. So you'll go straight in, I think. But also they won't ask you all the questions.
Yeah.
You know, it'll just be like an easy judgment-free, stigma-free service that will also be express, if you know what I mean.
One thing I've always struggled with when I've gone into a clinic to get a sexual health test is obviously now with the job I do, I'm an exotic dancer, stripper, whatever you want to label it. When I was a burlesque dancer, I never really counted myself as a sex worker, but I guess because the nature of what you do is you dance in a very sexual way. They always ask, are you a sex worker in the sexual health clinic? And I kind of am, like I am, but also I'm not engaging within sexual contact. So almost like if I'm not, I do tick that box because I am, but like I don't know if I'm inviting questions that
loads of people do, like for example solo OnlyFans, and they would be sex workers, right? They might not class themselves as sex workers, but like that is it's the same kind of industry, but they're not at risk of acquiring STIs or HIV. Yeah, that's probably not the right way to ask that question.
But then again, if we go into and it's good we're speaking about it, but if we go into kind of saying, are you a contact only sex worker or a full service sex worker, is that almost othering them and saying they're this type of sex worker? And because there's a lot of judgment, you know, there's almost this joke of strippers don't like prostitutes because basically it's the more extreme version, and they think, why would you do that?
Yeah,
you know.
When I tried it, I enjoyed it. The only reason I didn't do any more of it was I was too anxious.
Anxious.
Yeah. I mean, I was only 19 or I think I was young. I might have been 18. I was 18 or 19. And I was terrified and, you know, just really anxious about the whole situation. But the actual job itself didn't put me off.
No.
I was doing this for free quite a lot with a lot of different people, and if I'm going to get paid to do it and somebody's happy to pay me to do it, then great. But you know, there are lots of people who do it because they enjoy the job. And it's important to recognize that. Like a lot of again, coming back to like political discussion in the media and stuff, there's a lot of this just assumption that if that's your job or if that's what you do, it's because you've got no other option or you're forced into it. And they talk about like trafficking and all that kind of stuff. Like they immediately go to
it's like
the extreme.
Needle. Yeah.
And it's like, no, there are plenty of people who choose it as a career because it's what works for them, and they should be free to do that. Like,
I mean, there's a lot of, from what I know, and my friends who do full service, not necessarily with themselves because they don't necessarily want women. A lot of men hire other men in forms of prostitute for sex work, so gay prostitution. But obviously straight men who want to try something, like you said, the men who are straight but want to try a gay or bisexual experience. As I said, there's a lot of men in strip clubs who don't feel like they can express sexuality, but they obviously tell a stripper or someone they're working with about that because they don't feel the shame there, they don't feel the stigma. And I just think how many like men are not having full and complete sex lives, because they're not being open. But it's always the same age, the same look, from the same generation of men.
I remember like one phone call I took on the helpline a couple of years ago, and it was from a guy, and he had paid a male sex worker because he wanted to try, having sex
I hope
with
you
a
paid
man.
him very handsomely.
Well, he kind of said, so he was asking questions about STI and HIV risk, and he was asking them in a, sensible and respectful way. It wasn't like, because sometimes you get people who call up who've, procured the services of a sex worker, and suddenly there's a lot of stigmatizing language about the other person. And, I don't really have much time for that. But this guy was quite respectful. But he was basically saying that he had been the receptive partner in anal sex because that's what he wanted to try. And because people said to him, like, you might find it pleasurable or whatever. So he's like, I'll give it a go. And he decided that he would do it, by, paying someone to do that. And I think one of the big things for him was he was disappointed that he didn't enjoy it.
He didn't, or he did?
He didn't. And so part of me, I was trying to answer his questions and like give him emotional support at the same time as well. But part of me wanted to say like, maybe it just wasn't the right circumstance, or maybe you should try it again because like it can be very pleasurable. But I was kind of like, you tried something. Maybe it's not for you, and that's okay. And well done on you for at least giving it a go.
Does he see it as a waste if he didn't enjoy it? Like,
I don't know. It's like he had to overcome the stigma. Ideas of masculinity and the ideas of like, I'm heterosexual, just see maybe what I might enjoy, or like test a boundary or whatever. And then it's like, so I've put in this effort and it's not paid off.
If anyone worries about masculinity and kind of dibbling and dabbling and you're a straight man, Tom Hardy used to dibble and dabble apparently. So you can't get any more masculine than that.
You talk about like masculinity and like the like ideal of masculinity, and all of these kind of like big kind of muscle bound guys, and it's like if you go down to the gym and you see all these big muscle bound guys, like, well, at least I mean I live in central London, half of them or more are gay, like
probably on steroids.
Some are, yeah.
Would you call them a bear?
I think, well, I'm not too up on all the different language, but like bear is generally, there's some hair involved. So they might be like they might have a beard, they might have like hairy chest or whatever. They might be quite muscly. They might have like quite big arms and stuff like that, a big chest. But they might also have a bit of a belly. So it just depends. Like people have different definitions of bear, and bear is quite a wide term for different people.
I've heard like twink as well.
Yeah.
Twink. That's
like a kind of like younger, more fresh faced kind of yeah, I think I was probably a twink in my teens.
Twink and proud.
So, but coming back to that point, like, lots of people will try different things. And sometimes what happens, and what we find when people call our helpline, is that because they've maybe tried something that's outside of the norm for them, or that they think is a bit taboo. I know, like, you've been talking a lot about kind of taboo things on the podcast. Yeah. They assume that there's going to be some big disastrous consequence. And immediately, for some reason, STIs and HIV is the thing that they think is going to happen. So like, I've done this thing, and it might be, I've procured the services of a sex worker, or it might be
I sat on a towel.
I've tried whatever for the first time. And so they're like, convinced that they must therefore have contracted an STI or HIV as a result. And you have to kind of explain to them that viruses and bacteria don't make moral judgments about what you're doing and then decide whether or not to intervene. Like, they have to be present and they have to be able to be transmitted from one person to another. And sometimes when people are talking about worries about risks they think they might have had, they're talking about a scenario that it will be impossible for anything to be passed on. And, you know, but the anxiety is very real. And so we have to kind of get people to understand that that's just not the way that viruses and bacteria work.
Well, it's interesting, like with the education, I think what you're saying, let's look at the science, let's look at like what is actually evidence and proof. And we've discussed, I wouldn't regard myself as a religious person, and I think actually when it comes to religion, it has less of a place in a school for young people than science and sexual health does, because it's not fact, it's not evidence. So it's interesting that people are willing to put these ideals, and I don't know if indoctrination is a powerful word, but like products of a dogma onto someone and deny the evidence. I just think it's bizarre. But yeah, well, anyway. The last thing I kind of want to touch on is chemsex.
Oh, okay.
So kind of what are the best courses of action for people to look after themselves within chemsex in regards to HIV? You said with the mental and then like with the physical kind of precautions.
Yeah, I think like it comes back to that idea of understanding what's right for you, understanding your own boundaries, what you are and aren't like willing to do. And obviously when drugs or chems of any kind are involved, like that can get blurred quite quickly.
So chem is including all drugs?
Yeah. Okay. Any kind of like chemical assistance or stimulants that you might have in sexualized drug use. So it's where in most cases it will be where somebody is either taking drugs to enhance the experience of having sex or the pleasure, or to prolong it, or for lots of different reasons they might, or because sex while high is something that they're looking for. For some people that is the only way that they can have kind of sex that they want to have, and sometimes that's psychological. So you might get some people who are like, I will only have this type of sex if I'm really high, and then maybe I'll have regrets about it afterwards, and so like there's a psychological element that needs to be addressed there, and that person probably needs a bit of support and a bit of counselling and a bit of understanding. Mm-hmm. So whilst understanding the psychology around it is important, and also to understand like what is right for you as an individual, and also think the practical things of like, where is it coming from, and can I trust that it's not going to kill me, or whatever else, and dosing and all that kind of stuff. You have to know all of that stuff. But in terms of sexual health and STI and HIV risk, I think it's really important to be aware of PrEP. So that's something that we want more and more people to be aware of PrEP. So I mentioned before, it's pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a pill that you can take. The easiest way to take it, the way that everyone can take it, is to take one pill every day, and it will stop you from being able to acquire HIV. So it prevents HIV from taking hold. So even if you come in contact with HIV, if you have sex without a condom, PrEP will stop HIV from taking hold in your body. That's something that we need people to be aware of. It's available for free on the NHS. If you go to a GUM or sexual health clinic, you can have an assessment for PrEP. It's available to both men and women, and non-binary people and others. There are different ways that you can take it. If you are a man and or you mainly have anal sex, you can take it in about 3 different ways. There's what's known as event-based dosing. So as little as 2 or up to 24 hours before you have sex, if you take a double dose of the pill, it will be effective, and then you have to take it for a certain number of days afterwards. You can check our website for any of the details around this, or the iwantprepnow.co.uk website has some good information around that. If you're a woman and you're mainly having vaginal sex, you need to take 1 pill every day, and that's partly because it takes longer to be absorbed into the vaginal tract than it does elsewhere. But everybody can take 1 pill every day, and that will protect you from HIV. So that's important for people to know, particularly if they're engaging in chemsex, because a lot of the time, if you go to like a chemsex party or something like that, it could last, an entire weekend or an entire week or longer. So it's important to remember, like maybe set an alarm, make sure that you're taking your PrEP on a regular basis and stuff like that. If it's lasting longer than maybe you initially expected it to, make sure you have enough PrEP with you to last the duration.
Or maybe on your fitness watch if you have one on and stuff.
Yeah, you can set yourself a reminder. There are like little pill cases you can take to have like, a few pills with you.
Because if you're in the chemsex party having fun, you're not going to be looking at your phone.
No, you might not be even looking at what day it is. I don't know. So yeah, that sort of thing is important to remember. I know it's not fashionable these days, but be aware of condoms. They're a thing you can use and they will protect you against HIV and STIs. Make sure you're getting tested on a regular basis for everything. You know, if you're just regularly sexually active, whether it's chemsex or not, I think it's really important to be aware of that. And also know where to go if either things go wrong or you need support around it. Because like some people, I'm not one of them. You know, I've mentioned before, addiction has been part of my story. I'm not somebody who can either drink or take drugs in any kind of moderation. So for me, it's like all or nothing. So I've been sober for 5 years now. I know that there isn't a way that I can safely and for my own mental health be able to engage in anything to do with drugs or alcohol. And that's just, you know, me. And there's a lot of people who, you know, are predisposed to addiction, and that might be the case for them. There's lots of help and support available if that's the situation that you're in, but then there's lots of other people who can do it perfectly well and, you know, have control over it. And it's something that they do that it's either enhancing their pleasure or it's allowing them to have the type of sex that they want, and, you know, it's providing them some sort of benefit without necessarily giving them the mental health side effects that might come with it for somebody who is predisposed to addiction or who might be struggling with some kind of aspect of like the psychosexual and therefore is engaging in chem. So there's like different types of people who would be involved in chemsex. That's the important thing and it's important to know what category you might be in, but also be aware of the fact that it can lead to, it could lead to addiction. It could lead to mental health side effects that maybe you're not looking for. And it's important to know where to go to get support if that does happen. So we've got a chemsex counselling service, and there is an organisation called Controlling Chemsex who can help with stuff like that. I know you spoke recently to the people at Dean Street. They've got a really great chemsex service there as well. We work with them in our chemsex service to deliver support and stuff to people. So all of those things are important to be aware of. In different parts of the country, there will be different services available. And some kind of just general drug and alcohol recovery services have some specialist kind of chemsex services as attached to them. There are lots of ways that you can get support if you need support. So if you try something and it's not right for you, you know, maybe try something else. You can always call our helpline for you know, signposting or help or support around that, or if you just want to talk. But yeah, I mean, there's chemsex is something that, I mean, particularly in the gay community or in the LGBT community, it's something that's been a big phenomenon for quite a few years. For some people, it's causing some issues. For other people, it's just like, it's the way that it's what they do. But, you know, we just need people to be aware of making sure that they're looking after themselves, testing on a regular basis, be aware of PrEP. And if you find that it's too much or it's not right for you, know where to go to get some help and support. It is something that as well we're seeing increasingly with young people who, you know, like across the queer spectrum are getting more involved in, you know, relationships with multiple people and stuff like that. It's becoming much more fluid, I think, the way that people are approaching relationships and sexuality and sex. So chemsex is part of, you know, what people are looking into. So it's not just gay people who are involved in chemsex, obviously. And, you know, it's everything.
If you're on cocaine and you're having sex, that's chemsex.
Yeah. Or if you're, you know, in my case, for a long time when I was a cocaine addict, on cocaine and on my own, I was still engaging in chemsex. Like I was online for days and, you know, and that's sexualized drug use. It just doesn't involve another person and therefore doesn't involve like STI risk necessarily. But that is something that I really struggled with. And again, for me, like a lot of the mental health stuff was what was leading me to that place. And what I needed to do was deal with the underlying mental health issues that I had to be able to get out of that spiral I was in.
Yeah. I think that's also really important to say that you can have preventative methods of thinking about it from a very mental aspect of being intentional why you are engaging in chemsex versus not having that intention and stuff. And
it's also important to remember that not everybody engaging in chemsex is doing it in a harmful or you know, it's not always soothing some underlying mental health condition. It's just that for those people who are, it's important to be aware of it and also to know where to go to get support.
A lot of men that me and my friends have dated or, you know, had sex with, cocaine is the constant through line. And I think as well in cities it's common. It makes you feel more alive. It boosts your personality. I tried it once, personally wasn't never into it, but so many guys are like, let me do a line before like I have sex, and it's almost they need to amplify of what's already in there before sex, and it helps them last longer as well. But sometimes I'm just like, I don't want that. I just want you. You know.
Yeah.
Romantic.
I think from people I've spoken to in my own personal experience, it is something that will generally like make you last longer. For some people, it's the opposite. It will just like kill it immediately. But for some people, it will, it will enhance things. I think a lot of it is psychological. So it's like it gives you confidence that you didn't otherwise have. And I think there are other ways to access that confidence. And also, for me, it's like false intimacy in a certain way as well. Before I did a lot of therapy and work on myself and got into rehab and all that kind of stuff, I did not understand what intimacy was at all. Like I didn't have any experience of what intimacy looked like or felt like or anything like that. It was something that kind of scared me. And for me, even from a young age, like sex was just something that I did because it was pleasurable and like involved another person. It wasn't something that I did that was necessarily had romantic connotations, or I didn't understand like
what you said is such just like a boy thing. Like I can't like sex is just a thing and I really enjoy it and I can go and do it and I can like, for me it's like
my first sexual experiences were with friends of mine and
Yeah.
we didn't have any, like we were friends
Romantic.
who had sex.
Yeah.
And I went on my first date with a guy when I was like 16 and like we had sex and stuff, and that was a bit different, but I never really kind of like really properly understood what intimacy could be like until I got into like, I'm in a relationship now for 16 years and I've learned a lot during the course of that relationship. I've gone through some really difficult periods like that. During this relationship that I got my HIV diagnosis, that I got really into addiction. I'm very lucky that my partner's stuck with me this time, and I think our relationship is better than ever, but it's only now that I'm really understand the value of intimacy and that it's not as scary as I thought it was. But I think coming back to the point about like lots of people taking cocaine, I think it's partly as a way of short-circuiting that kind of intimacy barrier, if you know what I mean. And I'm sure you get it in the clubs as well, that like loads of people who are coming in.
Oh, I prey on people who are high on cocaine.
Yeah.
Like,
well, because like the barriers are down,
Yeah.
and it's like they'll do anything. So like they'll be quite free with money and stuff as well.
When people mention they're on cocaine, I try and instantly walk away because I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to even know that you're on it. If you're on it, fine, fair enough. But there was this guy who he was raving. He was like, I've lost my bag. And he's like, no one's getting any dances until I find my bag and stuff. So all these girls were like looking on the floor, looking for this bag that he'd lost and stuff, but not intentionally because no, we don't want to comply.
Yeah.
Because drugs are wrong.
You don't even,
I have to
you don't
say,
be complicit in somebody else's possession of a Class A substance.
if anyone's going to come for me, I'll give a disclaimer of drugs are wrong. You shouldn't be taking them unless it's in a country that's legalized.
I have a slightly different...
it's not how I feel, but it's what I should say.
Yeah. For me, I'm happy to say that like I know drugs aren't right for me.
Yeah.
I know other people who can like perfectly well take drugs and it's great for them. Personally, I'm in favor of decriminalization and legalization of pretty much all drugs. But as long as the support is available for people who do struggle with addiction and stuff like that, which I don't think it is. But
then they're going to start watering that shit down. Do you want that? Well, I mean, I suppose it doesn't affect you too much anymore.
I think kind of the opposite, because like there's a lot of like contaminated stuff that's out there, and if it was properly regulated and you knew exactly what you were getting, it would be like a bit less of a... People would not struggle with dosing as much as well. I don't know. It's anyway, that's getting too much into the drug side of things. But when it comes to like sexualized drug use and stuff, people can struggle. Drugs can be a way of like people overcoming certain like barriers that they might have in their mind about sex.
And strippers will fleece you of all your money when you're on cocaine.
I think quite rightly in many ways. Like people who are going into that kind of situation and they're going in high, they're there to have a good time, and you're part of like making sure that they do, and so you deserve to be compensated for that.
I think everyone looks sexier on it though.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes I've looked like an absolute... I remember I went on holiday and had sunburn all over my face and I was peeling. I was like, I'm going to make no money tonight, but I have to show up. And there was this one guy and he must have been on some... I think he was on a concoction of things. And he was like, you're the most beautiful person I've ever met. And kept on speaking 2 million miles an hour. And I was just like, I'm really not tonight. Like, my face is actually peeling off. But anyway, £500 later... Anyway, this isn't a stripping episode. This is a Terrence Higgins Trust episode. Yeah.
No, I think coming back to the point about like how do you make sure that you look after your sexual health when you're in that kind of situation, PrEP is really important. I think people need to be more aware of PrEP. When we were talking before, I was talking about the inequality in access to PrEP. So whilst gay and bisexual men in particular have been using PrEP for a long time, it's led to a large decrease in new cases of HIV. It's really great. It's now available for free on the NHS. If you look at how PrEP is getting to people, there are no local authorities in England where there are more than 5 women signed up for PrEP in that area. That's something that it's a scandal we really need to change. There's too much gatekeeping as well of PrEP in those services, and women aren't being recommended PrEP when they should be. But to compare to that, no more than 5 in any one local authority, women accessing PrEP. Dean Street, who you were talking to before, they have more than 20,000 gay and bisexual men signed up to their PrEP program. They've been leading on this for years, and they've been running the program for a long time. I think if you look at the statistics, there are more people signed up through Dean Street to be on PrEP than there are in all of France, as a comparison. And I think more there than probably in the rest of the UK combined. They're doing really, really well. But what we need is for that type of service where they're really actively, trying to get PrEP to people, to be available everywhere, and to be available to women, to heterosexual people, everyone who needs it.
I think I mentioned to you before, in the Netherlands, when I used to live there, I was just doing a routine sexual health test, and they asked when was the last time I did bloods for HIV. And I said, 6 months ago. And they said, well, we won't give you one because unless you're participating in someone who's had been exposed to HIV and you're a straight woman, we're not going to give you and waste a HIV test and stuff because you're not at risk. But like you said, with the statistics of women having HIV, it's actually probably more important to have that.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, we have too many instances of somebody who should have been offered an HIV test not being offered an HIV test.
Better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah. As an organisation, we will almost never say to someone you shouldn't have an HIV test. The only times that I've ever said that to anyone is people who've called our helpline who've been I had this risk 3 months ago, or more than 3 months ago. I've done 12 HIV tests. They've all come back negative. I'm you don't need to do any more tests.
Health anxiety.
Yeah. What you need to do is focus on your anxiety, because this is it's not healthy. It's impossible for 12 tests to be wrong, that taken at different times with different blood samples. This should give you comfort, and doing a 13th test isn't going to tell you anything that the first 12 didn't, because, it's been the right window period and you've done the right thing and you've taken the right test. But other than those extreme examples, we will recommend that people are encouraged when they want to have a test to be given a test. There are too many scenarios where women especially are engaging in sexual and reproductive health services, should be offered a test or should be offered PrEP, and then don't get offered that. Another thing to be aware of when it comes to testing is, we talked about earlier on the different ways that people can test. You can test at home, you can test in a GOM clinic, at your GP. If you're living in an area of England with very high HIV prevalence right now, so that's London, Manchester, Salford, Brighton, Blackpool, a few places like that, and you go to A&E for any reason and they're taking blood, they will automatically test you for HIV now.
Okay.
That is something that people in the past might have thought that just happened anyway. But it's something that we've had to have a long campaign on to roll out this, what's called opt-out testing in accident and emergency departments. The next thing that we want is for that to be rolled out to areas of high HIV prevalence next. And those are a lot of the other kind of big cities in England. So Newcastle, Nottingham, Leicester, places like that. And what we found in the first year of that being available in those A&Es is they're testing for hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV. They've found hundreds of people that they wouldn't have otherwise found with Hep B, Hep C, or HIV. They've also found people who were living with HIV who'd previously been diagnosed but had disengaged in services. So they weren't taking their medication, and they managed to re-engage them in services. And, you were talking about rural areas and people who aren't normally targeted for testing. I think the first person who got a reactive result from an opt-out test in A&E was a white woman in her 70s who would not otherwise have been tested for HIV. So that's why it's really important that as we get closer to that 2030 goal of eliminating transmission, we're not just focusing on the traditional, what they call key population groups, the gay and bisexual men, and other men who have sex with men who are about 40 times more likely to be living with HIV than the general population, black people of African heritage in the UK, men
minorities.
and women. Yeah. are about 7 times more likely to be living with HIV than the general population. Black people of Caribbean heritage, about twice as likely. So there are some groups that, because there's been higher prevalence, they've been targeted with testing and services more, and like stuff's been advertised to them. That a lot of that work, I mean, there's still more of that needs to be done, and there are still communities that aren't being reached in the right ways. But as we get closer and closer to the 2030 goals, we have to widen the net more. And it's going to be more difficult to find those few people in like lots of different areas of the country, in lots of different communities. And we need people to be aware to test for HIV on a regular basis if they're sexually active. Older people as well, who might be getting out of long-term relationships, might be postmenopausal, not thinking about contraception, having sex for the first time in a while with different people. Make sure that they're aware and that they're testing as well. Because the numbers of people living with HIV who are young are going down quite significantly. But the numbers
of
people,
your work.
Yeah. Well, largely, yeah. The number of people over 50 is going up quite significantly, like massively. Partly that's a really good news story, because people who are diagnosed with HIV in their 20s, 30s and 40s are living into their 50s, 60s and 70s, which they didn't always used to do. So that's good news. But there are also people being diagnosed. And if you're older, if you're heterosexual, if you're white, if you're Black African as well, you are disproportionately likely to be diagnosed late. So that means after HIV has had a chance to weaken your immune system to a certain level. And that's something that we really want to avoid. Like, if you're diagnosed late, you can still go on medication, you can still get an undetectable viral load, you could still live a long and healthy life, but it is associated with worse outcomes health-wise, especially in the first year after diagnosis. So we want people to be diagnosed as early as possible. And that also stops the onward transmission of HIV, because if you're diagnosed early, you won't have had as much time maybe to pass it on to someone else.
I don't know if this helps with your 2030 goal, but the pensioners are getting it on a lot. There's a really high sexual infection rate with pensioners, especially in care homes, I didn't know about. And maybe people don't think about that group, as a...
We're doing more and more work in care homes at the moment.
Gladys and Keith.
Yeah. Just like to make people aware, older people have sex too. Let's not forget that.
Quite a lot of it.
Yeah. And, they might be having, quite active, quite healthy and happy sex lives. But they need to be aware of the risks associated with that. Especially
because they had zero education growing up.
Yeah. A lot of people that age, might not have had any sex education. And when they go to their GP with symptoms that if they were in their 20s, they'd be like, oh, let's just do these tests. The GP looks at the person and doesn't think about sex. And we need to make sure that people are starting to, realize that everybody is a sexual being in their own way, and, maybe having quite an active sex life.
They're the people who've probably had the most sex in the world, pensioners, because they're the oldest. So it makes sense why they'd want to master their expertise, I suppose.
the other thing that we're seeing more and more of is because we're probably at a stage now where, or very soon, there'll be more people over 50 with HIV than under 50. And that's only going to increase into the future, particularly if we're successful at stopping transmission. People who were diagnosed with HIV in the 80s and 90s who are still alive today, there are, not as many as there should be, but there are quite a few people, are at that stage, that age where they might be needing care either in their own home or in a care home. And we know from the work that we've been doing that those organizations, those care homes, those carers don't really know much about HIV and might have outdated information. So we're trying to get the latest information to people to make sure that one of the people who volunteers with my program is in her 70s. She's been speaking about HIV for years, and she says we don't want to go back into the HIV closet. We've done all this work getting HIV to where it is and overcoming stigma. I don't want to have to go into a care home and be silent about it, or be treated differently. Or we've heard of cases of people who are going into the room of somebody who's living with HIV and putting on loads of PPE, like they're walking into a nuclear reactor or something. And it's that is completely unnecessary. That we should have left that behind in the 1980s. We know how HIV is transmitted. Somebody's not going to be a risk if you're wiping up after them or washing them or providing those kinds of services that you would need to provide to someone in a care home. And it's also important that you know that person is taking their medication, every day on time, and stuff like that. So
especially
we
if
have
you're a
work,
carer.
Yeah, we have work to do to make sure that carers are aware of this. Being a carer is like a really difficult job because it's extremely poorly paid. It's very difficult. It's very specialized work. It's really undervalued. I think, again, this comes back to like gender inequality because it's seen as like a female role and therefore worth less than, and I don't know many people who could be a very good carer and do it well and would accept that kind of level of wage, especially. Anyway, sorry, that's going on. But they also don't have a lot of time. So they don't have a huge amount of time to learn about things like HIV. So what we're trying to do is be quite innovative in getting bite-sized information to people who are carers or working in a care environment, so that if one of the people that they're caring for is living with HIV, that they know what they need to know to make sure that that person gets the right level of care, that it's free of stigma, and that they know that it's not a risk to them.
Okay, all right. So we are wrapping up a little bit now. How can people best support the charity, whether it's through fundraising, volunteering? What's the best course?
Well, there's lots of things you can do to help. Some of the most straightforward are, how you can help us to get to the 2030 goal of eliminating transmission is take care of your sexual health, look after yourself, test for HIV and STIs, and, take a healthy attitude to looking after your sexual health. So that's really important. There are lots of ways that you can fundraise and help us raise money to get to those goals. If you check out our website and click on, so go to tht.org.uk, you can find links there to different ways that you can fundraise or donate. There are lots of things that people do, everything from like shaving their head to a marathon to standing at a train station with a bucket on World AIDS Day. There's loads of things you can do to help, or standing outside a theatre. You can volunteer. So if you go onto our website as well, there are volunteer roles available, and there's everything from, in some of our local sexual health services, there's some volunteer roles there. You could do like volunteer receptionist, or if you're living with HIV, you can volunteer as a Positive Voices speaker in the program that I run. There are also jobs available, if people are looking for paid work. And the other thing that people can do is, follow us on social media. And when we're putting out information about different campaigns, amplify those and talk to your friends about the fact that people on effective HIV treatment can pass on the virus. Let's start normalizing conversations about sexual health. That's another thing that you can do to really help. Lots of campaigns come up. A lot of it's to do with like what's going on in politics and stuff, but you'll see from our social media that we also support other organizations' campaigns. So recently, for example, the Be Past the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, we're trying to make sure that, so during COVID, they moved to a process where if you needed emergency contraception, you could get it through the post, and you could have a telephone consultation about the fact that you needed that, and it would be prescribed and it would be sent to you in the post. And that was just put in for COVID. But there was a campaign after kind of lockdowns ended to make sure that that was still available, because it was actually a service that people were finding quite useful and quite beneficial. And so we supported, some of the campaigns to make sure that could continue, and it was voted through, and that is available now. So there are lots of things like that come up from time to time where we need people to be aware of issues around their rights and stuff like that, and maybe to sign a letter or sign a petition, or there's a form sometimes you can fill out to automatically write to your local MP about stuff like that can be really helpful as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that is a lot of ways people can support as well. You're very good at covering everything in a conversation.
I'm sure I've forgotten something.
Okay, so my final question for you before we wrap up is, what would be your stripper name?
What would be my stripper name? Oh, that's really hard. I had my parents visiting me a couple of weeks ago, and I dropped them off. They were going back to the airport. I dropped them off, and I was walking home, and I had some friends who were over for a barbecue, and I was walking through this park, and this name came into my head, which I was like, this would be a really good drag name. Mm. And it was Miss Diana Gnosis.
Oh. And your routine can be around that as well.
Yeah, I guess it would work as a stripper name as well, but well, maybe not. It's a bit, it's a bit medical. But
I watched a burlesque recently that was to do with a woman who was a weather reader. So you can be a bit on the nose with it. Oh. Okay, don't rule out.
I once went to a burlesque show in Soho. I can't remember what the occasion was. There was some occasion, and then we ended up going to this thing, and it was a lot more extreme than I was expecting. Mm. It was fun, but I was like, wow. And like people were really into it, and I was like, a first timer at this, interesting burlesque, I was just like, wow, this happens a lot, like in lots of different places.
But I'm happy to be here, and it's all good.
Yeah. I mean, I've been around gay bars a lot in my teens and 20s, and not so much now because I'm like, I just turned 40 and I'm in a long-term relationship, and I just stay at home with my partner and the dog that we foster guide dogs for the blind as a volunteer role. And so like, I'm very much like a home bird now. I go to bed early. Like, I've gone into my middle age early, but back in those days, like, I would go to a lot of gay bars, and there would be like lots of different types of shows, like drag shows and all the rest of it. But you got a lot of gay bars where they would just employ strippers to like strip and dance on a pole and stuff like that.
Women?
Men.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was about to say, I don't know what I have that you want, but
Well, like you would sometimes get women as well in some of those places, but it wasn't like, it's kind of different because it wasn't like a strip club, and people weren't necessarily tipping them as much. I mean, I'm sure some people were, but it was just they were dancing on the bar in a bar. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
try Hunkamania. That's always a good night out. And Magic Mike, apparently that's not that good.
Was that the one in Leicester Square?
Yeah, we have a lot of customers, female customers, who come in for a Magic Mike saying they weren't really satisfied because it's too artsy now. It's about the performance. They just want to see some cock in their face, really. But
I understand that.
But there we go. On that note, thank you, Eugene, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Are there any links people can follow?
So if you go to tht.org.uk, you can find all the information we've been talking about. You can also find signposting to sexual health services, or if you call our helpline THT Direct, you can search for that online. We can help with any questions you might have, or signposting to any kind of services. And then if you follow us on social media, we're generally at THT.org.uk, all one word, on most social platforms.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you would like to learn more, follow the links that Eugene mentioned. Thank you for listening to this episode of Sexonomics. All our social links and listening platforms will be available on a tap link in the bio. Thank you so much for your time. Speak to you soon. Bye.